Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today you're joining us as we zero in on a moment in early American history that might seem like a footnote, but actually sent ripples across the entire Revolution: the capture of Fort Ticonderoga on May 10th, 1775.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a really interesting collection of pieces. You'll be hearing about the events themselves. We've got maps that'll help you visualize the location, and even some images. Flags that flew, the fort as it looked then, and, well, later in ruin. Plus, a look at Benedict Arnold through a historical engraving.
Our goal today is to cut through the surface and understand why this seemingly small military move was so significant. We want to explore the strategic thinking, get to know the fascinating individuals involved, and trust me, there were some big personalities, and really trace how this early American victory had, well, surprising and far-reaching consequences. Okay, so to set the stage, where exactly was Fort Ticonderoga located, and what was its strategic importance in 1775?
Okay, so if you look at the maps we have, you can see Fort Ticonderoga was situated in Essex County in the province of New York, around 43 degrees 50 minutes north latitude and 73 degrees 23 minutes west longitude. Now, when you consider its strategic place, especially given its later fame, you might think it was a critical stronghold in 1775, and in a way it was. But its really vital period was actually during the French and Indian War, when it controlled that crucial waterway between French and British territories.
Right, so it had this almost legendary status, didn't it? I've seen it described as the gateway to the continent, and even the Gibraltar of America. That paints a picture of a real powerhouse.
It definitely had that reputation, yeah, built on its earlier importance. However, the reality in 1775 was quite different. The accounts we're looking at describe a fort that had fallen into disrepair years before when the French abandoned it. They actually blew up the powder magazine, and it had just deteriorated further since then. One source even says it was more like a backwoods village than a fort. So while the name might conjure images of an imposing fortress, the truth on the ground was, well, much less impressive. This past perception, though, versus the present reality, might have played a role in the British underestimating its value.
That's a fascinating point. So who's actually stationed there in this backwoods village of a fort? I'd imagine a substantial British force, given its grand reputation.
Surprisingly, no. The garrison was a rather small detachment of the British 26th Regiment of Foot, just 2 officers and 46 men. And what's quite revealing is that many of these soldiers were described as invalids, meaning they had disabilities or illnesses that, limited what they could do. There were also 25 women and children living at the fort. So not exactly a robust fighting force ready to repel a major attack.
Wow, just 46 men and invalids. That really flips the script on what I imagined. Okay, so the fort wasn't exactly a fortress, but then why risk an attack to capture it? What was the key motivation for the Americans?
The American need for artillery was absolutely critical at that time. Fort Ticonderoga held a significant collection of heavy guns, cannons, howitzers, mortars, which the colonists desperately lacked in the early stages of the conflict. Think about the ongoing siege of Boston. The Continental Army was in dire need of firepower to effectively challenge the British forces there.
Absolutely. Those cannons become incredibly important later on. I remember reading about that. But surely there were other reasons beyond just acquiring artillery.
Definitely. The strategic location on Lake Champlain was still vitally important. Control of the lake provided a crucial communication route between the colonies and the British-controlled territories to the north. Even more importantly, from the American perspective, it prevented the British from potentially launching attacks from the rear towards Boston. If the British had maintained a strong presence at Ticonderoga, they could have posed a significant threat to New England.
So it was a dual purpose, then acquiring much-needed weapons and preventing a potential British strategic advantage. Were the British completely unaware of this? Surely they must have recognized the fort's potential value, even in its state of disrepair.
General Gage in Boston certainly did realize the fort's importance after the events at Lexington and Concord. He sent instructions to Quebec Governor General Guy Carleton, ordering him to refortify both Ticonderoga and Crown Point. However, and this is a really crucial point, that message didn't reach Carleton until May 19th, which was well after the Americans had already seized the fort.
May 19th. But the capture was May 10th.
Exactly. That delay seems incredibly significant.
It does. Were there any factors beyond just slow communication that contributed to this lack of British preparedness? Did they perhaps underestimate the likelihood of an American attack on this particular fort?
That's almost unbelievable, a key order arriving after the objective has already been lost. It sounds like a major oversight on the British side, and, well, a stroke of luck for the Americans. But luck wasn't the only factor, was it? There were specific individuals who recognized this opportunity and took the initiative.
Precisely. Benedict Arnold, who had some familiarity with the fort from previous travels in the region, actually mentioned its condition and the weaponry it held to members of Silas Deane's militia on his way to Boston after the events of April 19th. This sparked the Connecticut Committee of Correspondence to take action.
Right. And John Brown, an American spy, had also identified its strategic value even earlier. And of course, you have Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, who had their own motivations, seeing its importance in the ongoing dispute over the New Hampshire Grants territory land claimed by both New York and New Hampshire. So you had several individuals and groups all converging on the same idea, each with their own reasons.
It sounds like all the pieces fell into place at just the right moment. So how did these different groups actually coordinate to make this happen? It wasn't a unified command from the outset, was it?
Not at all. Connecticut really spearheaded the initial effort, borrowing funds and recruiting volunteers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and the New Hampshire grants. Then you have Benedict Arnold, who on May 3rd managed to secure a colonel's commission from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. This commission specifically authorized him to capture Fort Ticonderoga, and he was provided with money, supplies, and the authority to raise up to 400 men.
So Arnold had the official backing and the resources. What about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys? They were already moving in that direction, weren't they?
Yes, they were already heading north with their own recruits, partly driven by the strategic implications for their territorial disputes. When Arnold reached their headquarters, things became complicated. Holding an official commission, Arnold naturally asserted his authority and command over the operation. However, the Green Mountain Boys were fiercely loyal to Ethan Allen and much preferred to serve under his leadership.
Well, I can imagine that created some immediate friction. Two strong-willed leaders with their own agendas trying to take charge of the same mission.
Exactly. There was a significant clash of leadership. Ultimately, they reached a compromise, although the precise details are still debated by historians. Some accounts suggest Arnold was granted joint command, while others indicate he was simply permitted to march alongside Allen.
It does sound like an uneasy alliance.
Hmm.
What were the main points of contention that made their cooperation so difficult, and how did they manage to overcome those enough to achieve their immediate goal?
Well, it seems like the shared objective of capturing the fort, combined with the urgency of the situation, likely forced them to put aside their differences, at least temporarily.
Makes sense, yeah. So, with this joint leadership, however fragile, how did the actual capture on May 10th unfold? It almost sounds like a daring raid by a small group of rebels.
In many ways, it was. Around 83 men, led by both Allen and Arnold, made the initial crossing of Lake Champlain. The boats they had weren't sufficient to transport the entire force at once, so the rest were intended to follow. As dawn approached, fearing they would lose the crucial element of surprise, Allen and Arnold decided to proceed with the small group they had.
Talk about a gamble. Attacking with significantly fewer men than they had hoped for? That's incredibly bold. Did they manage to take the British completely by surprise?
It appears so. The lone sentry stationed at the south gate reportedly fled after his musket misfired. Following that, a local teenager named Nathan Bayman actually guided the Patriots into the fort through a postern gate that had been left unlocked. They then moved quickly to rouse the sleeping British troops and officers at gunpoint, beginning to confiscate their weapons before they could mount any real resistance.
Wow, that's incredibly audacious and effective. And then comes the legendary demand for surrender, right? In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. Did Ethan Allen really utter those iconic words?
That's certainly the version that has gone down in history, and Allen himself claimed he said it directly to Captain Delaplace, the fort's commanding officer. However, some historical accounts suggest the demand might have been directed at Lieutenant Feltham, Delaplace's assistant, who was the first to confront them. Regardless of the exact phrasing or who it was addressed to, the demand achieved its purpose. Lieutenant Feltham initially hesitated, but Captain Delaplace soon appeared and surrendered his sword.
Incredible. A fort with such a strong reputation falling, with barely a shot fired. Were there any casualties during this daring takeover?
Remarkably, there were very few. One American sustained a minor injury from a bayonet. That was the extent of the fighting during the actual capture of the fort.
But the story doesn't end with the surrender, does it? I recall reading something about the fort being looted in the aftermath.
Unfortunately, yes. Once the remaining American forces arrived, swelling their numbers to around 400 men, the fort was indeed plundered for liquor and provisions. Arnold, still struggling to assert any real authority over Allen's men, was unable to prevent this disorganization, which only added to his growing frustration. Despite this chaotic scene, Allen did ensure that the captured British officers, including a major, a captain, and 2 lieutenants, were sent as prisoners of war to Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull.
So Ticonderoga was now in American hands. What was the immediate next step? Did they consolidate their position there?
They didn't rest for long. The offensive quickly expanded. Just a day or so later, Seth Warner led a detachment and successfully captured nearby Fort Crown Point, which was even more lightly defended, with a mere 9 men stationed there. Then, about a week later, Arnold, with a force of 50 men aboard the captured schooner Liberty, which he promptly renamed, of course launched a raid on Fort Saint-Jean on the Richelieu River further north in southern Quebec.
That's quite a bold move, pushing deeper into British territory.
Yeah.
What did they hope to achieve with this raid?
The primary objective of the raid on Fort Saint-Jean was to seize more military supplies, additional cannons, and in particular the largest British military vessel on Lake Champlain, HMS Royal George. They were successful in capturing the vessel, and naturally Arnold renamed it Enterprise.
Ah, the Enterprise. And Allen.
Ethan Allen, not wanting to be left behind, attempted to follow Arnold north in bateau, but the Liberty, with the advantage of sail, quickly outpaced him.
It does sound like a bit of a race for glory unfolding between Arnold and Allen. Did Allen have any success when he eventually arrived at Saint-Jean?
When Allen reached Fort Saint-Jean, he received a warning from a sympathetic merchant in Montreal that British troops were approaching. He hastily penned a message intended for the citizens of Montreal and then made a swift retreat back towards Ticonderoga, arriving just as the British forces appeared on the scene. In his haste to depart, 3 of his men were left behind, and one of them was subsequently captured.
So a series of rapid, decisive actions that significantly shifted the balance of power in the Lake Champlain region. Let's zoom out now and consider the bigger picture. What was the true strategic significance of these early captures?
For starters, it severely disrupted British communication lines between their forces stationed in Quebec and those in Boston and later New York. This essentially severed their overland supply routes and compelled them to reassess their entire command structure in North America.
It sounds huge.
It was. This meant that crucial intelligence and orders had to travel much longer and more circuitous routes, creating delays and making coordinated efforts between Boston and Quebec significantly more challenging for the British.
That's a massive impact, stemming from what initially seems like a relatively small-scale operation.
Right.
And I know this directly leads into our next point, the potential for an invasion of Quebec.
Exactly. The capture of both Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Crown Point provided the fledgling Continental Army with a vital staging ground for the invasion of Quebec later in 1775. Without control over Lake Champlain and these key fortifications, undertaking such an ambitious military campaign would have been considerably more difficult, if not entirely impossible.
And of course, we absolutely cannot overlook the artillery. The noble train of artillery, as it's so famously called. Tell us more about the crucial role those captured cannons played.
This, for many historians, is considered the most significant long-term consequence of the capture. The cannons and other military hardware seized at Ticonderoga were desperately needed by the Continental Army then engaged in the siege of Boston. Under the remarkable leadership of Henry Knox, these heavy guns were transported an incredible distance, hundreds of miles across Massachusetts, often through difficult winter terrain to Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston Harbor.
Yeah, the effort involved. Just transporting those heavy guns over hundreds of miles through difficult terrain in the winter, it's astounding.
It truly was. Henry Knox's success in this endeavor was a testament to American ingenuity and determination, and those cannons fundamentally shifted the balance of power in Boston. The presence of this artillery forced the British to evacuate Boston in March of 1776. This decisive event was a direct result of the initial capture of Fort Ticonderoga.
So this early American victory, often overshadowed by later, larger battles, directly contributed to the liberation of Boston. That's an incredible link. Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the personalities involved were quite remarkable. Let's delve into the well-documented rivalry between Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold.
The inevitable clash of egos. Both Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold were larger-than-life figures, each with a strong desire for recognition and honor for their roles in these events. This quickly escalated into a rather bitter war of words between them. Arnold, feeling that his authority was being undermined by Allen's fiercely loyal Green Mountain Boys, began keeping a detailed diary that was highly critical of Allen's leadership and conduct.
And Allen certainly didn't hold back in his assessment of Arnold either, did he? I remember reading his memoir.
Not at all. When Ethan Allen later penned his memoirs, he notably and completely omitted any mention of Benedict Arnold's significant role in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga.
Wow. That's some serious historical shade being thrown.
Hmm.
It really highlights the depth of their animosity, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It was a blatant attempt to claim sole credit for the victory. The disputes over command continued even after the capture, especially when Connecticut and New York began sending their own troops to the region, ultimately leading to Arnold's growing frustration and his eventual resignation from his commission later in 1775.
It sounds like the internal politics and personal ambitions within the early American forces were just as complex and challenging as the external military threats they faced. What was the immediate reaction to all of this up in Quebec and back in England?
In Quebec, news of the American captures caused considerable alarm and concern among the British authorities. Colonel Dudley Templer in Montreal immediately called for the raising of a local militia and attempted to secure support from nearby indigenous populations, although with limited success. Governor General Carleton, once he received official word of the fall of Ticonderoga and Crown Point, swiftly ordered the reinforcement and fortification of Fort St. Jean and other strategically important locations to better defend against any further American incursions into the region.
And back in London.
Back in England, Lord Dartmouth reportedly considered the loss of Fort Ticonderoga to be very unfortunate indeed, clearly recognizing the potential strategic ramifications of this early American success.
They were right to be concerned, weren't they? These seemingly small early American victories had some quite significant and lasting long-term consequences.
Absolutely. The disruption of British communication and the need to redeploy forces in response to the American actions inadvertently led to a division of their overall command structure in North America. General Howe was eventually appointed commander-in-chief of forces along the Atlantic coast, while the northern frontier effectively became a separate command.
Okay, like a two-friend situation.
Kind of. And while this mirrored a successful organizational model from the earlier French and Indian War, during the Revolution, the lack of effective cooperation and coordination between these two distinct commands would ultimately prove to be problematic for the British war effort. Some historians even suggest that this lack of cohesive strategy and communication played a contributing role in the eventual failure of the British Saratoga campaign in 1777, a pivotal turning point in the war.
That's a fascinating connection to a much later and incredibly important battle. And Ticonderoga itself, its story doesn't simply end in the spring of 1775, does it?
No, it certainly doesn't. The British did manage to briefly recapture Fort Ticonderoga in July of 1777 during the Saratoga campaign as part of their broader strategy to gain control of the Lake Champlain corridor. However, they were forced to abandon it again just a few months later, by November of 1777, following their decisive defeat at the Battle of Saratoga. So, while its initial capture by the Americans was strategically vital, control of the fort itself continued to shift hands during the ongoing conflict.
So to bring it all together, this deep dive into the events of May 10th, 1775, clearly demonstrates that the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, despite not being a large-scale military engagement, carried profound strategic implications for the entire American Revolution. It provided the Continental Army with desperately needed artillery, significantly disrupted crucial British communication networks, served as a vital launching point for the subsequent invasion of Quebec, and vividly illustrates the complex personalities and the early leadership challenges within the nascent American forces.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates how seemingly minor actions in the early stages of a conflict can trigger a cascade of events with major and far-reaching consequences.
And on that thought, here's a final point for you to consider. Given the significantly dilapidated condition of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775, and the surprisingly small and largely infirm British garrison station there, what does this tell us about the perceived priorities and strategic assessments of the British military command in those very early stages of the American Revolution? And how might a different, perhaps more accurate evaluation of the fort's potential strategic value, even in its weakened state, have potentially altered the course of events in those crucial first months of the American struggle for independence? It's certainly something to really think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.